So we might continue. So verse 3. In all my deeds may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them. So there's a sense here that the 8 verses are arranged in a sequence of practice. They actually make sense in terms of how we approach our own transformation as a person. And so in the first verse, for example, we've identified the fundamental problem and we've dived right into it. Then with the second verse, we're trying to open out our awareness to be able to consider others in a realistic way, at least begin to approach them in a realistic way. And in the third, we're looking back upon our own engineering, our own processes, to work out how that informs all situations. And what we mean there is, instead of turning the torch out, we revert it and shine the torch in. So rather than thinking, oh, you're to blame for this, and you haven't satisfied me with this, and you've ignored me, etc., etc., and as we said before, that's an infinite process of storytelling. Here we give up that process, at least strategically, and say, all right, what's going on in my mind when those things, those objects are being produced externally from my side? What's involved in producing these hallucinations, in fact, that are being projected outwards as reality? And this third stanza is inviting us to practice directly by observing our own mind. And this is very, very challenging. I remember once feeling depressed. Once I felt depressed. Took a while to get a laugh for that one. Once I was depressed, and I felt depressed at that moment. And I mentioned it to Geshe Doga, and Geshe Doga, in his brusque manner, which I often got, said, meditate on the depression, and walked away. No one else had told me to do that. So I sat down and meditated on the experience of feeling depressed. I barely, B-A-R-E-L-Y, barely observed the unfolding sequence of a depressed mind arising within me. And that was revelatory, oddly enough, because it was the last thing I'd ever done. I'd always been objectifying my depression in stories to do with failure or yucky factors and so forth. There were always reasons why I was depressed. So there was a kind of searching for meaning in that depression. At no point had I ever faced the bare recognition of the experience of having a mind of depression arising. So when I'm just saying this as a kind of example, when I did turn the torchlight onto that mind, what appeared initially insurmountably monolithic in its ghastly force wasn't in fact this monolithic force at all. And I had the experience in my meditation of kind of walking through the depression as though walking through a wall. I know it sounds a really odd way of putting it, but what appeared to be a blockage, i.e. my depression, when I just simply focused on it, seemed to disperse, and it lost its grip, and I found a way of seeing through it to another state of mind, which wasn't depressed. And so I didn't apply a direct remedy. I'm just mentioning this in general terms, because I'm not saying that depression can be dealt with in this way or that you shouldn't take medication, etc., etc. I recognise the serious nature of depression. But I'm really inviting us to think that there are also other ways of working with it. So this idea has got caught up very much in our culture now, in the mindfulness movement and cognitive psychologies and so forth. There's a whole body of evidence out there now that shows that simply being aware of the mind that's arising has a very, very powerful effect.
It's like, say, like with anger, well, where is it in the body?
Yeah.
Can you actually pinpoint where it is?
Yeah. So what happens when you do that? No, but it's interesting, isn't it?
I suppose it's just something that I've heard about.
Mm.
In the past, of actually trying to find where that particular thing is that you're concerned about.
Yeah.
Or whatever, and trying to locate it.
Yeah.
And the more you try to find it and locate it, it just disappears. It goes.
Mm.
It's only having that energy and that force while you're giving that,
Yeah.
that to it. When you actually try to challenge it and look for it, it's like, yeah, it goes. So,
Mm.
What do you think is like any thought?
any thought.
Yeah, any thought. What is a thought? We have a thought that something is something is good, something is bad, something so that you know what we think, feel. It's like if we grow, then in the end, like, what is it? What color is it?
Yeah, exactly. And actually find its true essence and where it resides within you. It is actually really there, just a manifestation.
So this idea in this verse, in all my deeds, not just some of my deeds, all my deeds, may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them. As soon as they arise. There's a great poignancy in those words, because the Buddhist presentation is that if we can catch the moment of early mind generation of anger, for example, we have an opportunity to avert it that isn't there later on. And Shantideva gives a very, very beautiful analogy of a spark on a bed of straw. That once the straw is alight, it's very difficult to extinguish the flame, but it just takes a deft movement of a single toe to crush the spark that's the incipient fire in that first moment. So if we can develop this capacity to introspectively view and analyse our mind as it's arising, we have this opportunity of stepping in and reworking circumstance in a unique and powerful way. This is something we don't learn at school, but why? This is probably the most powerful life skill we're ever going to learn, but no one teaches us. How come it's been left out of our education?
Well, they do now.
They do now. Can you give an example, Jane? Yeah.
Dalai Lama's inspired a whole series of education, social, emotional and ethical learning sealed.
Yep.
And if you look, it's being delivered in mass.
With great success. Yeah.
Look it up, if you teach it, you can download
Yeah.
lessons.
And so children flourish with these techniques. They get them straight away. It's much harder for us adults because we're invested so deeply in our thought structures we were talking about before.
It's included in the curriculum in British Columbia in Canada as
Mm-hmm.
well, the kindergarten, or what they call K's.
Yeah.
So they do exercises in mindfulness. But the only trouble is, and I don't want to be negative.
No.
You know, because it's part of the bureaucracy, then they've got these kind of, you know, how they have, what do they call them here, where they have those random tests everywhere. So they have these kind of, you know, things like that kind of, they're very rigid and they don't necessarily fit, you know, the students that have to do it in this particular way at this particular time.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a little bit of improvement to be made there. So.
It's been quantified in a way that it doesn't seem... Yeah.
Kind of tends to, you know, that's a bit better.
Yeah.
There is an online, online open course, no? On the website called Demystifying Mindfulness, and the question there is it important for teachers mindfulness? Isn't it important for teachers meditation? And how do we qualify teachers? So one of the questions is why it's, you know, the buzzword mindfulness, everyone is talking about it. But how do we, for it to be funded at schools, we have to quantify it. We have to be able to put a tick somewhere, and it's not possible. Because it's like helping someone with a depression. You know, very often it's a lot of emotional labor involved in it, on both sides of suffer, and always helping them. That is very hard to quantify, to put a number to it, to tick a box. So then it becomes a bureaucratic exercise.
So there's two aspects involved here, at least two. One is mindfulness, and the other is discriminating alertness. And so these two, they're both minds, states of mind, but they have different aspects. So mindfulness is that ability to recall from one moment to the next an object. And that object is being remembered in the next moment. We can only have a continuity of awareness of an object independent on memory. Isn't this interesting? We have to remember that we were meditating on the breath in order to recall our awareness on the breath in the current moment. Then that becomes remembered in order to have an ongoing awareness of the next moment of the breath. So we have to be able to apply that ability to rest on the object from moment to moment without losing it. And that's the same in this meditation with the arising of an affliction. We have to be able to rest our mind on the arising of the infliction, in this case, say anger, with the same degree of clarity and precision that we did with the breath. And discriminating alertness is an aspect of the mind which sneaks in from the side, so to speak, to evaluate what kind of mind is arising, what aspect it has. And this second, discriminating alertness, is a conceptual mind. It's discriminating and evaluating and drawing a conclusion. So those two minds have to act in concert. They have to be yoked together. Discriminating alertness needn't be applied with full force continuously because it becomes exhausting. So we can simply become aware of anger, for example, arising, and then almost as though we're not intruding on the anger, because we want to observe it, we don't want it to flee, we don't want to frighten it away because we can't meditate on it. We want to actually see it in action. So for that we have to have very light, slippered footsteps. So mindfulness very accurately and gently and carefully holds the awareness of that mind of anger that's arising, and discriminating alertness then slips in like a spy to determine what aspect, what caste that particular anger is producing in terms of our view of reality in that moment. So you can see here how important it is to have both those aspects. And so when it says, in all my deeds may I probe into my mind, and as soon as a mental and emotional fictions arise, as Zen himself, may I strongly confront them and avert them. We can only do this if we've identified them accurately and recognise their shortcoming with discriminating alertness. Then we can bring in an armoury of resources to transform and to rework the problem of that mind arising. So there's no, we're talking about optimism before, there's no hopelessness in this situation, in the sense that we acknowledge that we can be overwhelmed by anger and seem to be completely its victim or its slave. But if we develop this skill to become mindful and apply discriminating alertness early on, we'll find that we'll begin to be able to rework the ingredients of the situation in a way that will prevent the full-scale onslaught of the afflicted mind from getting underway. This is the promise of the technique, and it's incredibly powerful. It works. We also use it in positive senses too. We're only talking about dealing with an affliction, but if we're generating a little tiny bit of love, little tiny bit, we recognise with mindfulness that that's love. We try to continue with it into the next moment, and then with discriminating alertness we see if we can fan it out a little bit in strength to encompass more beings, more passionately or more carefully. So we try to enhance it using the same technique. So it's not just geared towards identifying problems, we also use it to enhance our positive states of mind as well. So that's why it says in all our actions, all my deeds. So deeds here is including physical deeds, verbal deeds, and mental deeds. And mental deeds precede physical and verbal deeds. It's the most important aspect of observation and the most difficult, most confronting. Normally by the time we've got ready to hit someone in rage, it's a sign that we're already well down the track, a disastrous trajectory of the mind generation of anger. So it's kind of almost like a late symptom of a problematic generation of a difficult mind. So if we develop the capacity to becoming aware of the mental arising, we can actually circumvent it before it becomes physical or verbal. Who's had the experience of saying something really harsh and horrible to someone without even thinking? At least half the people here have had that experience. It's kind of shocking, isn't it? That capacity is almost mind-boggling, really, because it seems to be self-generated, self-accomplished, self-fulfilled, but it's not. If we can begin to break it down in experiential terms through becoming aware in meditation, we then can carry that awareness into daily life. And so, to cut a long story short, there'll be a twinge often, even physically a twinge, of discomfort that arises when someone begins to offend us. It can be a little slight constriction in the chest, for example. And this mind of irritation begins to unfurl at the same time, and it begins to escalate, and the conceptual mind then kicks in and starts saying, "You're doing it to me again. That's it, that's that behaviour again. I hate that behaviour. Why are you doing this to me?" And off you go. It's this cascade effect. But it started with a twinge of discomfort. So if we train ourselves in detecting the affliction at the first moment of arising, if you like, we'll feel the twinge and go, uh-oh, anger twinge, and stop it in its tracks at that very moment. Which, as I said with the analogy of the spark on the straw, can be done much more easily than it can be to restrain someone who's attacking another person with a mind of rage, for example. Even the police can't stop people attacking people in the mind of rage. You know, if someone's that far into an act of violence, it's very difficult to take them out of it. And we know that with children's tantrums as well, don't we? Once they get into a tantrum cycle, it's very difficult to intrude. So we're going to do a meditation now on anger, and some of us will say, we've done the anger meditation before. Anyone thinking that? But I'm going to say that it's still probably a little bit relevant, because anger gets up and away pretty easily. Eh? And what we're going to do in this meditation, we're going to go through a series of steps to actually identify it and see how it works. But then we're going to move into a series of remedies. So it's a very, very positive presentation. It gives us a series of tools, if you like, which we can employ or learn to employ. And so this will be our meditation for this verse. So just spend a moment consolidating our awareness of our body on this spot. Spend a few moments resting our awareness on the mind, just observing whatever mental states are appearing. And feel that we're going to direct the energy of the meditation towards understanding anger. So anger has an object. We can be angry towards people, so just explore this, our own experience of anger, how it can be directed to people. Is this true? Anger can be directed towards things. Is this true? Even inanimate things, such as a door. How many slammed doors feature in anger scenarios? Anger can also be directed towards our own suffering. For example, when we're sick, we get angry with our sick situation, wishing it was otherwise, aggressively. Or angry that we haven't responded in a particular way to an event or a person, etc., etc. So if we probe a little bit further, anger arises due to exaggerating the negative qualities of a person, an object, or a situation. Anger superimposes qualities that aren't there. So what is the aspect of anger? What's the intention of anger? So try to think in terms of anger itself. What does it attempt or seek to do as a force? This can be very confronting, this recognition. If you look very, very deeply, we see that the aspect of anger is to harm the source of our unhappiness. So in the ridiculous case of slamming a door in rage, we're effectively transposing our frustration or wish to harm a person onto a wish to harm a door. We kill the door as we slam it. This is shocking to consider. At least it wasn't a person. Or maybe it already was. So this intention to harm as the nature of anger is worth keeping in mind. This said, anger is a generic term. It can include being irritated, hypercritical, overly judgmental, self-righteous, belligerent, outright hostile. So the exact opposite of this mind of anger is the mind of patience, referring to that ability to remain undisturbed in our confrontation with harm or suffering. Being patient doesn't mean being passive. Rather, it gives us the opportunity or clarity to act or not act skillfully in that situation. It gives us scope. So let's reflect now on our own experiences to examine whether anger is destructive or useful. Just checking, am I happy when I'm angry? To interrogate ourselves. Am I happy when I'm angry? Do I communicate well when I'm angry? How do I act when I'm angry, or what am I capable of doing when I'm angry? You can throw this question or investigation into relief by considering that later when I'm calm, I can look back at my actions done under the power of anger. Perhaps we can't even recognize ourselves in that situation. Anger produces monsters. We also consider anger from the perspective of others. How do others respond to me when I'm angry? What impact does my anger have on others in terms of their perspective of me? Even the most beautiful person spits and froths in anger. They become a fearful object, so much so that even animals, dogs for example, will hide behind sofas or under chairs because they know there's an angry person in the room or in the house. So to put it bluntly, does anger produce mutual respect? Does anger produce harmony? Does anger produce friendship? Now there's a particular efficacy in meditating on anger when we're not angry, because we have an opportunity to view it more clearly. But by this I mean we're now going to fabricate or generate a situation in our meditation in which we were angry. So we try to re-establish a moment of our experience, perhaps in our recent past, or a little bit further back, wherever we need to go for the sake of the meditation, in which we did lose it. We were indeed angry. Just allow this situation to come back to life again through recollection. We're not trying to interpret it or make it go away. We're trying to actually acknowledge what it was like in this moment, what it felt like, what we did, how things appeared. Now holding this situation in our awareness, we test it with discriminating alertness, asking, did our anger magnify and escalate the problem of this situation, or the opposite? What did anger do, in other words, in this situation? What was its capacity or its potency? What did it engineer? More seriously, perhaps, what did it achieve? What was its outcome? Look at the actual consequences of this moment in our experience. and ask, did our anger have the potential or capacity to hurt or harm? Did it hurt or harm? Even if we regretted this later. So now check whether this anger was realistic as a strategy in our lives. Did it have the function of bringing about my happiness? If we're really honest and open, we can see that this anger arose from a very narrow self-basis, the self-cherishing attitude itself. This self-cherishing attitude had the aspect of totally disregarding the well-being of the object of our anger. So now, put yourself in the place of the object of our own anger. Just imaginatively transpose your situation to the object. How did it feel to be the brunt of our anger? So if this is a shocking recognition, it's because we don't allow ourselves to think what it feels like to be the object of our anger. And we also know how self-righteous and aggressive or defensive we can be if we see ourselves as the object of someone else's anger. Normally, or often, we reply with anger ourselves. So we try to intrude on this scenario now by looking at techniques for working with the anger. The first of which is to blame the delusion and not the person. So this is even the case with ourselves. Rather than putting ourselves down as a hopeless case because we've got angry or can get angry, we identify anger itself as the problem because it infects or floods us with a force that makes us act destructively or harmfully. Therefore, we should oppose the anger and not the person. This applies to ourselves, but it also applies to our regard for another person who's angry with us. We blame the delusion and not the person. Shantideva famously said, if I become angry with the yielder, although I'm actually harmed by the stick, then since he too is secondary, being in turn incited by hatred, I should really be angry with his hatred. So anger, as a delusion, wields us as its stick to injure or instrument the injury to another person. We become a tool of anger. So another technique is to accept the problem as our own karmic fruit, thinking previously I must have caused similar harm to sentient beings. Therefore, it is right for this harm to be returned to me, who is the cause of injury to others. Another aspect of this particular reflection is that, given certain sets of conditions, even an unangry person can become an angry person. So I, in the past, have many times acted out of anger and have caused great hurt. So why should I now be so surprised if I was hurt in turn? So another strategy is not to react at all. So this is like shutting down. Shantideva says, just as I'm about to act, I see that my mind is tainted by defilement. At such a time, I should remain immovable like a piece of wood. In other words, don't react at all. This is a holding position. It's not a solution, but it's certainly a very powerful means of avoiding the harm that might otherwise ensue. Another very powerful technique is to view the object of our anger as our teachers. Without the enemy, there is no chance to practice patience, accumulate insight, and potential to become enlightened. So viewing the object of anger as our precious teacher involves seeing it as an opportunity to illuminate our own shortfall in our spiritual practice. In other words, we identify that portion which is still capable of being angry, for example, because someone has managed to trigger our anger even with a mere gesture or word. So it's our responsibility to work with that anger. This is echoed in verse 6 of the 8 verses. When someone whom I have helped and in whom I have placed great hopes mistreats me in extremely hurtful ways, may I regard him still as my precious teacher. This is an opportunity to practice, a very rare opportunity. Another contemplation is to consider that the value of anger is zero. Nothing useful comes of it. So Shantideva says, even if your enemy is made unhappy, why our merely asking for him to be hurt did not cause him to be injured, And even if he does suffer as you had wished, what is there for you to be joyful about? If you say, for I shall be satisfied, how could there be anything more wretched than that? So the mind of anger is a wretched mind. And with that we conclude the meditation. So they're all techniques to be used side by side, or one or the other. It's not that they're somehow one's better than the other or they're mutually exclusive. But it's kind of suggesting that there's a larder full of techniques that we can draw upon. So who's had some experience with transforming anger into the path to enlightenment? Baby steps? So you do feel, though, there's some progress, though? Yeah. Yeah. And how does that manifest for you? How does it register that there are some baby step signs there? Not so angry. Yeah. Yeah. How do others feel, or what experiences have you had?
I think for me to understand that the person who I'm angry with just can't. This is how it is, and they just. This is not their fault. They can't do any different. And they just. They are happy in that way. You know, which is, I can't understand, and it's not a,
What about when you
for
get
the lack of,
angry?
it's not a good way or a positive way or way to be happy, but they are where they are, and, you know, they just have to be happy with their own.
So Cynthia's tossed you a question.
Sorry?
What about when you get angry?
Yeah, when I get angry. So I get angry because, so for me to understand that there is a limit that person can go to. This is how they know how.
So you think rationally when you're angry?
No, it helps me to stop being angry.
When you are angry, have you been able to stop that? How do you deal with that?
Yes,
Any strategies?
I use have you heard about acceptance and commitment therapy? The happiness step was the book. And there are steps. And the first step is diffusion, and I think it's a lot what you said. Diffusion, it means that when you have the thought that makes you angry, you make fun of it, for example. Or you look at it as like...
Have you done that? Have you been able to do that?
Yes,
Fantastic.
it's called diffusion.
That's great.
So, and then, so that's the first step. And the second step, acceptance. This is what it is at this moment. This is how situation is, and that's it. There is nothing else to do. And then you ground yourself in the present moment, so you start thinking about the breath, or what you see. And the next one is you think about your values. So what do you value? What do you want to be? It's a hard process. But I have very good teachers in my life, and I can practice very often, so yes.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't, I'm not angry, but yeah, so acceptance and commitment theory, but when we were doing the meditation, I realized that's exactly I don't know if the person who come up with it has anything to do with Buddhism, but it's actually there. The book is called The Happiness Trap. Yeah.
I had one yesterday, very fresh.
Oh.
And my very, very nice neighbour is really, really polite. And knocked on the door and said, "We've got to come and see what's in the car park."
Come and see, sorry.
Something's happened in the car
Oh.
park. And we've got to squeeze all our little cars in, big cars, wide cars, long cars now, and it's hard.
Mm.
And then he just kept trying to trap me into thinking that I had done it, and I hadn't done it. And so I just had to blurt out that now you've upset me and I can't talk to you anymore, and I stormed off.
Like a block of wood.
I just couldn't bear it any longer.
Yeah, but it was a solution, wasn't it, of sorts? Yeah. Mm.
And so I declared he really upset me.
Mm.
I said that was a lovely middle-aged lady thing to say.
Yeah.
Marched off. And then I did lots of furious housework where I did this thing. I carefully turned the torch inward. And I thought, look, he's such a nice neighbour. I don't want to have a horrible fight with this really nice neighbour. And we've got a bloody hard situation with his cars. And so after an hour or so of really clean, tidy flat, I went back out and I went up to him and his wife and he said, I'm very sorry. That was a terrible interaction. I didn't want to talk like that because you're my very nice neighbour. And he said, I'm very, very sorry. That was a terrible thing. We both apologised. And in the meantime, the lady in the next, another flat had overheard the barney,
Mm-hmm.
and she offered him her car park.
Mm.
So it was like a thing happened, and now we've got a nice solution, but it was partly because somebody had overheard it,
Mm.
did that. But I just knew there was no way I could go back out and not go back to him,
Mm.
because then it would have become a bad situation.
Mm.
So it was just going from somebody who's been a very nice person into a thing that was out of control, like in a flash, like that spark of whatever it was on the pale. So I don't know that I had any Buddhist techniques at all except to walk away with a pretty smart thing to do and go say sorry. But it diffused it.
Mm.
What was the car damaged?
No, we were just carrying on a fruit stand, which was just that something had happened, but I hadn't done it. I saw it, but I just rubbed my hand on it and it disappeared. You might have a little bit of attachment to that car.
Mm. It's the perfectible body of one's ideal attachment that he was concerned with. That's the thing about projection, isn't it? You know, it wasn't just a car for him. It was an emblem of his own perfect holding of identity and so forth. There was a whole lot of other issues involved. So anger is harmful in its intent. When I first heard that in the Buddhist presentation, it sort of took me by surprise, because often we're inclined to sort of try to rescue anger from itself by redeeming it as a sort of force of goodness in some way. And this definition of anger is quite relentless in its precision. It says that its intent is to harm. So once one recognises that, I find it's much harder to get a real anger underway because it's so appalling in its aspect. It's sort of unconscionable to be angry because you're just simply trying to get around or get going on harming something, i.e. another person. It can often be your most loved one that you harm the most, of course. This is what happens in domestic violence, which isn't such an abstract problem, is it, in our culture? And as Helen Garner and others have sort of explored, enraged parents will even kill their own children in spite of their partner as a means of punishing them in a moment of anger. Like, where is one's capability measured or drawn? It's kind of extraordinary what can actually occur. And there's a sense in Buddhism we talk about anger obliterating merit. And this is also a very powerful idea. What we mean by that is that anger doesn't just damage in the immediate moment, but it kind of damages our potential for goodness in general, in the sense that it sort of injures us and makes us less capable of being kind, for example. And so it's very destructive retrospectively in its impact on our own psyche, in other words. It has a corrosive effect on us. And it's interesting if we look at military training, for example. I don't know if there's any paratroopers here. There could be. But it's interesting when they teach bayonet training to soldiers, both men and women. I don't know if anyone's ever explored the psychology of bayonet training, but they use dummies, and you have to run at the dummy and stab it. And so they start with an anonymised dummy without any humanoid features, and then as the training progresses, they increasingly humanise the dummy, and they go even further, can you believe this, and they will racialise the dummy in the case of Afghan war and so forth, and they'll actually put features to do with headdresses and whatever it takes to identify the enemy, so that one can jab one's bayonet in with impunity at the mere sight of that face, without any conscious thought being involved. And that's a process of training which is effectively a dehumanisation based on an increasing articulation of the stereotype of the object of our anger. Huge amount goes into that training, and there's an incredible amount of psychological damage done to that soldier. Because in later life, when they return from the war zone, as we know, their partner upsets them and they violently attack and can even kill in that moment, because they've been trained to respond to a threat in that manner. And so they've kind of been not desensitised actually, but they're being realigned sensitively. And their sensitivity, their empathy has been damaged. And so in a way we train ourselves in our capacity to be angry. Every time we're angry, we retrain ourselves to be capable of anger again in the future. So there's a kind of momentum to the habituation or acceptance of the mind of anger. So this is why this process of stepping in is so incredibly vital. Even if it seems a very small step in one small moment of anger, it's actually rewriting a huge amount of material, if you like.
So with Fiona's example,
Yeah.
in verse 5, when it says, and others that treat me wrongly,
Yeah.
slander in school, I suppose it wasn't out of jealousy though, was it? But may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to the others the victory.
Yeah.
So that's the bit I always have trouble with, offering others the victory.
Mm.
So how, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let's throw it open because it's a big question. Did you have to accept that? Did you have to say offer the victory by saying, yes, it was me who scraped the car? Did that?
No, I didn't do that, but I made the apology.
Mm.
The interaction with the authors, I didn't want us to have a bad relationship and live next to each other. And that was the most valuable thing for them as well. But if he had been a nasty, horrible person, I might not have made the best apology.
I suppose that's a kind of victory, I suppose you've got to define what is victory. I suppose in that sense it may well.
But it was peace making those things.
Isn't it about the fact that it's not about you, actually you come to the realisation that it's
Mm.
not about you, so it doesn't really matter?
Yeah.
So you appease them because it doesn't really matter? That's, I
Mm.
have a sister whom I love dearly, that we would meet regularly at far-flung places, and after a certain time we had a spat and I thought, I've got to do something about this. So I came to one of these courses and I've had the best success because I can feel myself when I'm with still. I'm with her and we're sort of getting accustomed to each other again, and I can feel myself getting really uptight and I go, every living being is deserving of compassion. Everybody wants to be happy, and I just tell myself this is a mantra, and it's amazing. It diffuses. I change.
Mm.
Change. And I don't do it anymore.
Mm.
I don't have to spat. I just tell myself, I can feel it. Every living creature deserves compassion. Everybody wants to be happy, and I go, oh, okay. It's
Mm.
okay, don't worry.
Yep.
You know? So it's just what I do.
Mm.
I've told a story before about respite, which is my favourite. My two she was nasty, really nasty. She had to hate. And she went around the block of flats. It was my turn. She wanted the gate shut to keep her dogs and she wasn't allowed to have dogs. And I left the gate open. She went, she let fly. It didn't even use under the sun. I just stood there and thought, she's talking about herself. I'm just going to be a block forward. And she went on, and I did not react. And I finally, I said, all right, we'll shut the gate. And she didn't speak to me for 18 months. She couldn't face me. So, I didn't react. And we shut the gate.
Yeah,
And I shut the gate.
Very good.
yeah.
I was going to say to Cynthia in regards to offering the others the victory, think about your earlier example of when there's a project and you have your idea of how you think that project should be executed, and particularly in a workplace scenario, and sometimes you can't believe that other people's vision is so off the beam, and it can be really hard to go along with that vision and be a team player. And I think
This was at the end actually, but anyway.
Oh, but anyway, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or even just their behaviour or their point of view. But sometimes it's about just letting someone have their point of view. You know, and letting them have that.
I'd gladly let someone else do it if somebody actually wanted to do it.
I get, but I'm just saying, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
One of the stories that you read today about one with the baby.
Langri Thangpa.
When the woman came and made the baby and said, "This is your baby," and half of the people left. Normal people, we would say, "Don't leave. You know, this is not my baby. This woman is, you know." But the ones that left, they were not ready to see the truth. So he didn't care. He offered them the victory. In that moment, you know, for those people who walked out, that was a victory. In a way, that's how I see it. So it might not be a victory. Okay, this is what you think. You can go. That's really not my problem. I am here with other people that, you know, believe in me. It's quite with what is happening with all these celebrities and all these, you know, things around different people and politicians and the royal family, and you know, sometimes I wonder if I like someone and someone slanders them and tells terrible things, and I'm like, why doesn't she say something? Why doesn't she publish something? Why doesn't she, you know, want to defend them? But then as time goes, you realize, oh, okay, actually, that was not important. You know, it came, it went, but that person is still there, and I still respect them. And whoever understands respects them too. But who doesn't understand his? This is how I see that offering the victory. It's not the victory. It's not that they win. It's that.
Yeah, we don't offer the victory to negative thoughts. We offer the victory to the triumph of love and compassion. And so Langri Thangpa doesn't abandon the baby. His only concern was for the baby, not for his reputation. So he had nothing to lose. And he had everything to protect, which was the baby itself. Even if she hadn't come back, one would imagine that he would have continued looking after that child. And it was unconditional from his side to accept that baby as his. So that's the true meaning of having a baby, is to accept it. And so anger has the opposite aspect. It rejects and damages its object. It attempts to obliterate it, not to protect it. And so offering the victory in this sense is we don't lose sight of this need to care for the other. So if they get upset, we just allow them to be upset if they're really upset. We don't have to reply to that, but neither do we forfeit our love and concern for them. So in that deeper sense, we've lost nothing.
That's why I think it's important to get a connection with your values, with what do you want, how do you imagine yourself in the future, what is important for you. Is it important for you to tell this person that I'm right and you're wrong, or is it important for you to, be a calm person who, wants to benefit others?
Well, Langri Thangpa didn't say anything to defend himself as people were leaving. He just went on. I'm just saying it's interesting, isn't it? He didn't have any compulsion to protect his reputation. This comes in the last verse. May all this remain undefiled by the stains of the 8 mundane concerns. This last verse recognises that even very so-called advanced spiritual practitioners can still be doing a practice tinged by the delusions. So, we have to work on that to the very end. So we've only got 5 minutes, so we're going to dedicate the energies of the day. We've covered some ground. We've only begun to nibble really at the verses, but I want us to recollect the visualisation of Amitabha Buddha on a crown. And we make a dedication at the end of his teaching on the subject of exchanging self and others. Geshe summarised that the outcome of investigating this topic is to stop killing others. So make this wish that we'll stop killing others. We'll practice with a good heart, and we won't allow ourselves to come under the self-cherishing thought. Shantideva says, all misery in the world derives from desiring happiness for oneself. All happiness of the world arises from desiring the happiness of others. So the Dalai Lama recommends that we admire the spiritual ideals of the 8 verses, and that it's helpful to recite these verses and to reflect upon the meaning of the words while trying to enhance our altruism and compassion. Those of us who are practitioners of other religious traditions can also draw inspiration from these teachings, trying to commit ourselves to cultivating altruistic thoughts in pursuit of the altruistic ideal. So we dedicate the energy of the day with a wish to free all beings. I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. So His Holiness concluded his own commentary on the 8 verses with the words, in conclusion, my request, my appeal, is that you try as much as you can to develop compassion, love and respect for others, to share others' suffering, to have more concern for others' welfare, and to become less selfish. Whether you believe in God or not, in Buddha or not, does not matter. The important thing is to have a good heart, a warm heart in daily life. This is the principle of life. Finally, Shantideva says, just like a blind man discovering a jewel in a heap of rubbish, likewise, by some coincidence, an awakening mind has been born within me. may this awakening mind flourish and increase forevermore. So that's the dedication. I just want to mention at the very end, when Geshe gave his commentary on this subject of the 8 verses, he tackled the question of it being a secret practice, because it's been held for many centuries as in secrecy. And Geshe stressed that the reason for secrecy wasn't that we're holding something precious for ourselves, but that it's a practice that can be easily misunderstood by others. And so one practices these thoughts privately. We don't need to broadcast it. I'm taking your suffering, giving you all happiness as you yell at me. Just do the practice. And we don't need to justify it because it's based on completely sound principles which we've explored. So thank you everyone for your participation today and your involvement. It's gone very quickly and I've enjoyed very much this time with you. And take care.